From marrying minors to butchering babies, cults sure have a thing for the bizarre, and this list shows just how strange they can be. The Prince Philip movement. Before visiting Vanuatu in 1974, Prince Philip was just the guy who banged the Queen. But from the minute he arrived in this remote colony, the colonial officials treated him like a god. And while those officials were licking his royal boots, a couple of villagers from Tanna Island were watching this godlike man and losing their minds. To them, he was the son of the mountain spirit that traveled over their lands. So they built a shrine to him, and the Prince Philip movement was born. Who knew it was that easy to become a god? Certainly not Prince Philip himself. He didn't even know he was a god until some years later when a colonial official told him about the sect. And this got him hyped like crazy. They think I'm a god? I bet they don't know how much I enjoy being worshipped. Now Lizzie and the boys will show me some respect around here. So he sent them a signed copy of his photograph, and in exchange for his image, the Philippians, or whatever they call themselves, gave him a nal. And no, it wasn't a bag of weed, although it would have been sick to see a god get high. It was just the stick they used to kill pigs, which the Duke probably whacked Prince Andrew with when he saw him rolling with Epstein. Those islanders must have been really bummed out when Prince Philip died in 2021, now that they have to wait another 500 years for his return. This harmless relationship between a god and his subjects belongs in F tier. The School of Prophets. In 1983, one Long Lafferty told the Mormon Church that he had received a revelation. According to him, God had told him to tell the church to restore polygamy in its doctrine. But after listening to Ron's revelation, the church basically told him to cut that out because 1, he wasn't a prophet, and 2, they had outlawed threesomes since 1890. So Ron stopped. He stopped listening to them and continued preaching about his revelation until the church booted out the nuisance. But when he left, his 5 brothers went with him, and they started the School of Prophets together in 1983. At the time, Ron and 2 of his brothers, Dan and Alan, were already married, but none of their wives were willing to co-sign their husband's adultery. And Brendan, who was Alan's wife, particularly proved to be a pain in Ron's divine ass. She was a devout Mormon, so she didn't believe in Ron's revelation. But even after encouraging the other wives to leave their husbands, she remained with Alan. And this pissed Ron out of his friggin' mind. So the next time the revelation bug bit Ron, it wanted him to kill the 4 people fighting against the true saints of God. One of them, obviously, was Brendan. So on July 24th, 1984, Saints Ron and Dan visited her at home and killed her and her 15-month-old baby. However, later that day, Dan and Ron couldn't find the other 2 proposed victims. But the police later found these psychotic prophets, and while Dan is still serving his life sentence for his part in the murders, Ron died in prison in 2019 at age 78. Seeking to satisfy an overactive libido isn't a war crime, but killing a baby to achieve that is so deranged. E tier. Branch Davidians. Benjamin Rodell founded Branch Davidian in 1955 after taking over what remained of the Davidian movement in Waco, Texas. But after he died in 1978 and Lois, his wife, joined him upstairs in 1986, they left a power vacuum their son couldn't fill. So like all young stepdads do, Lois's boy toy Vernon Howell stepped in. But as Vernon Howell, his name was too weak for the cause. However, David Koresh sounded more marketable, so he ran with it. But that wasn't the only thing Koresh changed. He started tweaking the Bible and Rodin's teachings too, which allowed him to take several physical, spiritual wives within the community. Then, one day, he stood before the congregation at the Mount Carmel Center in Waco, Texas, and said, "You've all been out here making weak-ass babies, so, as the alpha male of this clan, I declare my intention to bed every woman here. I shall bless them with my potent seed, and soon I shall fill this world with my offspring, and they shall rule it as their dominion." Luckily for the world, Koresh's mutants never got to start their empire as his own empire started crumbling. A parent and some ex-members had accused him and the commune of child abuse, just because a couple of his wives were teenagers, which, honestly, They weren't to him, they identified as adults, and he saw no reason to treat them otherwise. And while the court was deciding who abused whom, the authorities began sniffing around Koresh's businesses, one of which was a gun store. So, when the feds knocked on his door on February 28, 1993, he was strapped and ready for war. And as the unexpected raid turned into a shootout, the Branch Davidians killed 4 ATF agents. With that, the cult basically called for the ultimate boss with 1% on its health bar. So naturally, the FBI and other big guns swooped in, but the resulting standoff went on forever. To stop the agents from breaching their fortress, the Branch Davidians walled themselves inside their headquarters. And they remained there until April 19, 1993, when a mysterious fire broke out in the building. This happened just as the FBI was trying to gain entry. And because the Branch Davidians couldn't get out, at least 80 of them, including Koresh, died in the fire. Straight up B tier, this one. The Manson family. Before Charles Manson started his family, he was in love with bars, and not the type you think. This guy had lived so much of his life behind bars that he asked not to be released from a California prison in 1967. "You're free, Manson. You know, I kinda like it here. The bed is hard, the food is bad, and all my friends are mad. I mean, I'd hate to leave the place that made me a bard." Get the hell out of here, Manson! But on the outside, Manson had nothing to fear. It was the 60s when the streets were tripping on acid, and everyone was praying to the sun. So out in San Francisco, he was able to play his rubbish music and charm some vulnerable young girls who would help him lure boys into his family. This kooky family later moved to Spawn Ranch in San Fernando Valley. There they lived on LSD and awaited Manson's prophecy of Helter Skelter. In summary, Manson predicted that African Americans would start a race war against the whites. The family would hide underground until the war ended. Then they would emerge to rule over what was left of the world. But as it turned out, that was just the LSD talking. And as Manson's music career failed and the African Americans wouldn't start the race war, he told his followers to set Helter Skelter in motion. On August 8, 1969, members of the Manson family killed actress Sharon Tate, 3 of her friends, and a visitor of her rented home. But they didn't stop there. They killed more people and were planning more murders when the police arrested them. And even though Manson didn't do the killings himself, he was sentenced to death for orchestrating them. His sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment, which he served until he died in a California prison in 2017. The actions of this C-tier cult are exactly why you should never listen to anything the drugs say. The People's Temple. In 1954, Jim Jones, this guy who looks like a bad Elvis waxwork, mixed Marxist liberation theology with Protestant practices, and the People's Temple of the Disciple of Christ was the result of that experiment. This church became quite popular among African American people since Jones was promising to end poverty and racial inequality, and by the late 1960s, the People's Temple had its headquarters in San Francisco, along with several branches and over 20,000 members in its congregation. Then, in 1974 in Guyana, Jones created an agricultural commune he called Jonestown. It seemed like a place he could establish the heaven on earth he badly wanted. Or maybe it was just the place to hide his maltreatment of his members, financial fraud, and child abuse. It looked like he was definitely trying to hide something because as the criminal allegations against Jones grew louder, he ran to Jonestown. And he took many of his church members down there with him in 1977. But the next year, the worried relatives of those members begged U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan to go see what was going on in Jonestown. And according to reports, his visit had gone well. But on his way back to the U.S., Jones sent armed men to kill Ryan and his entourage at the Guyanese airstrip. So, moments after Ryan's murder on November 18, 1978, Jones initiated what he called a revolutionary suicide. With the help of a Jonestown doctor, the church prepared a large concoction of Flavor Aid laced with cyanide and other toxic substances. They also had the temple's armed guards on hand to shoot members who refused the juice. And shortly after everyone had chosen their poison, over 900 people, including Jones, lay dead in Jonestown. Some bodies were later found in Guyana's capital of Georgetown, where members had taken their own lives because Jones said it was time to go. The flavor aid in the killer punch was initially mistaken for Kool-Aid, and this inspired the popular saying, "drinking the Kool-Aid," which is what you do when you gobble up every crazy idea from a higher authority. And just for making Kool-Aid uncool, this cult belongs in C tier. The Good News International Church. Paul Nthenge Mackenzie was the nutsack who founded Good News International Ministries in 2003. At first, the church was just inciting its members against Western evils like education, sports, healthcare, and powerful institutions like the United States and the Catholic Church. But in April 2023, Kenyan authorities discovered Mackenzie's hatred for golf and vaccines was the least of their worries. They found out he'd convinced his congregation to starve themselves to death. And they'd done so because it was apparently the only way to meet Jesus, which over 400 of them hopefully did. Did you get it? They died, so The authorities later found some of their bodies with missing organs, which someone had harvested and sold like potatoes. But the Kenyan government didn't appreciate this kind of farming. So in January 2024, a Kenyan court charged Mackenzie with 191 counts of murder. And since he sacrificed so many lives just to make it to this list, he gets B tier. Heaven's Gate. Marshall Applewhite was a psychiatric patient when he met his nurse Bonnie Nettles in the early 1970s. But they soon became best friends as they rode around the US to recruit members for their UFO cult, aka Heaven's Gate. Those who bought their message later joined them in a commune where they had fun eating bland food and performing castrations, which Marshall himself underwent. Okay, he was a little off his rocker, but you can't deny Marshall would have made a great president. Imagine a country of ballless men just getting stuff done. However, to his followers, he and Bonnie occupied even higher offices. They were not just prophets. They were the two witnesses mentioned in chapter 11 of the book of Revelation, and they were expected to fight the demons called Luciferians at the end of their prophecy. You know, regular cult gibberish. But alas, they couldn't fight the Luciferians together. Nettles died from cancer in 1985, and her death forced Marshall to alter Heaven's Gate's main doctrine. In their original belief, members were supposed to ascend into a spaceship alive, which they called moving to the next level. But after Bonnie died, Marshall threw the alive part out the window. So in March 1997, they prepared for their ascension by having a group meal in a nearby restaurant. And on returning to their rented California mansion, Applewhite and the 38 remaining members of Heaven's Gate consumed a mix of barbiturates and applesauce, sealed their heads in plastic bags, and died covered with purple clothes. Their destination was a spaceship flying behind the Hale-Bopp comet, but as far as the police knew, some days later when they found their bodies, they were just dead. No one knows if they did a peace out before they left, but their black tracksuits and Nike shoes show they went out in style. And that's some A-tier stuff. New Light of God. The New Light of God, or Nueva Luz de Dios as it's known in Panama, wasn't just weird, it was genocidal. One hot afternoon, probably after having too much maggot-infested coconut milk, Mario Gonzalez proclaimed himself the Messiah. And possibly because he knew that nonsense wouldn't fly in the city, he limited his message of salvation to one of the remotest parts of Panama. He was in the village of Alto Terron, preaching to the indigenous Ngabe Bugle people when one of his members had a vision. And a wicked mailman must have delivered that vision because its content simply read, "Repent or die." So Gonzalez and his unholy gang went from house to house to persuade the villagers to change their ways. Actually, they kidnapped several of them, tied them up, and tried to torture them into repentance. But they made a rookie mistake. They let 3 of their captives escape to a nearby hospital, and from there, those escapees alerted the authorities. And in January 2020, the police arrived at the Iglesia de Dios church and found 15 bound victims. Gonzalez and his people had subjected them to a manic exorcist ritual, and the victims had suffered burned tongues and machete cuts. But no sight was more disturbing than the fresh mass grave containing the bodies of Belen Flores, her 5 kids, including a 1-year-old, and their neighbor. And this becomes even more heartbreaking when you know that Flores was Gonzalez's daughter. But it's good to know those monsters won't be bothering anyone anymore, at least not until they complete their 50 years in prison. Definitely F tier.